about religious commitments. Sorry. I wonder if there's something unique about religious commitments which make that act of suspension impossible. And that's not to say that it will always occur, but there's something about religious commitments, because they are truth claims about the nature of the world, that they seem to differ in a way to other, even maybe strenuously held ideological commitments. Do you think, do you accept the premise or
well,
not?
Look, that it depends on the issue, but broadly speaking, I don't accept that as being a barrier to judicial impartiality. Every judge brings to their job his or her set of values, and you say, well, but a religious value has truth claims. I haven't met any judges, whether they be committed Catholics or atheists, who don't believe certain things are absolutely and fundamentally true. Every one of them brings a set of values to the position. And this idea that the premise of the concern is an assumption that religious people bring a set of biases to the job and non-religious people are this objective, clean slate, and only with that can true impartiality be brought to the adjudication of a dispute. I mean, really, with respect, that's just nonsense, because everybody brings a set of values. Everybody has truths in their life, and overwhelmingly, if not entirely, the disputes that come before a court are not disputes that engage in theological truths. And so I don't see any difficulty in judicial impartiality in that context. I mean, you might, of course, find a context in which one's religious belief would clash with an impartial adjudication of a dispute. But you might, and you can conjure up various examples of that. But you might, you know, if there was a law that compromised the ability of Jewish people or whatever faith it was to practice their religion, or questions of end of euthanasia, legislation of that nature, they are extremely few and far between. And that's not unique to the religious person. If you had to recuse yourself because you did not feel you could bring to an impartial mind to the adjudication of a dispute, that's a situation that potentially confronts any judge, no matter what their background is. So for a religious person, on the extremely unlikely occasion that arises, that's an example of how the judge should respond. I would have to recuse myself, as would a Catholic judge.
Yeah.
In certain circumstances.
Right. Now, there's a concept in halacha of, it's sometimes expressed as "Eit la'asod la'Hashem efer toratecha," which, as you know, stands for a principle that in certain extreme circumstances, it's necessary to sanction the contravention of the law, halachic law, for some greater good. Now, although it's used sparingly, I think its existence in halacha is well established. And the question I'm interested in is whether there is an equivalent principle in our Australian legal system. And perhaps you could answer that on two levels. Normatively, should there be such a principle? And then descriptively, whether it is done in any event.
Excellent question. Well, look, the sworn task of the judge is to apply the law. And that's what the judge must do. The concept of saying, well, I think to preserve good order, we ought not to apply the law here, or we ought to permit a contravention of the law, is not the role of the judge. That's the role of Parliament. And that distinction between the legislature and the judge does not apply in the same way in the application of halacha in the way that you have described it. And so a rabbi, and by the way, the application of that concept of Eis Lasis Hashem Efer Torah Techa is not a mechanism that is used by your average community rabbi when asked about everyday halachic problems. That adage is applied by generation giants like Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, as we both know, or other people of great stature. And so in the ordinary, and in there's a fusion, if you like, of the judicial function and the legislative function, because those great minds and those great sages are really performing not only a judicial function, but a quasi-legislative function because of the spiritual stature with which they have been invested by the community. And so to answer your question more directly, no, the judge cannot do that. So that's the first part of your question. A judge shouldn't do that, because if every judge thinks they can do that, that will blur the very important distinction between the judiciary and the parliament. What happens in practice, which I think is another interesting question. Of course, we all know that judges have a way of getting round problems they think are barriers to justice, to fairness. And different judges take different approaches to that. Some judges are more creative than others, and some are more black letter than others. And so the black letter judges will be dispassionate about the unfairness that their decision may cause, and say, well, that's not my job, that's the job of the parliament. Other judges might be more moved by the human condition and the fairness and seek to be more creative in the application of the law. But that's an example, by the way, of how different people bring different value systems to the job, independently of whether they're religious or not.
Do you think, though, that these more creative judges would admit to reverse engineering, or I mean, they claim that what they're doing after their act of creativity is applying the law, discovering it and applying it, and that maybe is a much more common feature of halacha as well, which is not an express, sanctioning of contravention.
Well, judges and rabbis have one thing in common: overwhelmingly, they think they're right. So they would say that what they're doing is truly applying the law. And so we have this concept in statutory interpretation, for example, of adopting a purposive approach to the statute, so that you read the statute with its purpose in mind. And sometimes that might lead to a straining of the text in order to achieve what the court considers is the purpose of the statute, or the mischief it is intended to address. And that can, depending on the judge, fall on one end of the creative spectrum or the other. But the judge thinks that he or she is applying the true intent of the parliament. And so to the rabbi thinks there it's not he or she, there it's he for the time being, just to excite your listeners, thinks he is applying the true intent of the halacha because the rabbi is invested with that discretion. And that is a difference between the function of the rabbi and the function of the judge, because the rabbi, by and large, also has a pastoral role to fulfill, and the rabbi might give a different psak to different people in different contexts, whereas the judge would not, because the rabbi has a discretionary, halacha invests in the rabbi a discretionary power within a range of possibilities that the rabbi applies by dint of his association with the person and his knowledge of the circumstances. So although there are obviously limits to that, I think a rabbi's function is in some sense more discretionary, which is ironic given the sort of broader perception of Orthodox Judaism as being dogmatic and inflexible. I think actually halacha is much more flexible than secular law in the hands of a judge.
Yeah, and maybe you can extend that reasoning to say that just as judges need to have regard to the purpose of the law, so too rabbis need to have regard to the purpose of the halacha, and to have access to that purpose, you need more than just knowledge of the law. You need that much broader appreciation.
That's what makes a good rabbi.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that contrast is an interesting discussion that you raise. Anyway, we could talk about that for hours, but anyway, keep going.
Let's move on. So staying on the topic of comparing our two legal systems, I've often thought about a difference between the two, which is the difference in the relationship between authority to time. So in halacha, the earlier the legal precedent, the more authoritative it is, and Mishnah is binding on Gemara and so forth. Whereas in our Australian and all common law systems, the later the authority, the more authoritative it is. Do you think this is just an accident of history, or does it reflect some more fundamental difference in philosophy between the two?
Well, I think the latter, because Judaism has a reverence for antiquity, because the closer you are to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, the more authentic is the authority. And particularly when you're dealing with an oral tradition, which is what halacha is based upon, then the closer you are to the source of the oral tradition, the more authentic is the psak. Whereas in secular law is based upon a premise that every generation is smarter than the last one, or builds upon the intelligence and wisdom of the previous one. And therefore, the latest learning or the latest pronouncement is more likely to be correct. So that does reflect something of a fundamental difference. Again, you raise a good point. But even in halacha, although that is foundational, the point you make is foundational. Of course, that's true theoretically, but in reality, the questions that occupy the minds of great halachic scholars today deal with issues that weren't around in the form they are now at the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, or even the Shulchan Aruch. And so there is a sense in which we do defer to later wisdom in halacha. Although the sources are more authoritative, the more ancient they are. When we look for a psak in relation to a challenging issue today, we also look for a psak din or a posek who has had the most recent experience of the issues as they are unfolding. And so while we have this great reference for antiquity and greater authority, the more ancient, the more authoritative, we also, I think, are very dependent upon more recent authority that has engaged in these issues, because we live in a very fast changing world, and the issues that halacha had to grapple with 10 years ago are different from the ones they're dealing with today. And we need scholars who can take that antiquity and deal with contemporary issues. And the more they can do that in the context of what's going on today, the greater they are. So I think in Judaism, it's a bit of both, really, in reality.
Yeah, and I think that balance strikes me as the best middle path, because the capacity for human progress through each generation seems empirically true, but a complete disregard for tradition leads to some of the problems of
Yes,
modernity, I would say.
I'm not sure I agree with you. I think it certainly must be the case that human progress from a scientific perspective, whether that's true from a moral perspective, it is in some respects. For example, the more tolerant society we live in today than we lived in 30, 50 years ago. But in other respects, I'm not sure that we can say that humanity has evolved morally as the generations and centuries have unfolded. I think there's considerable amount of evidence to the contrary.
And possibly more to come.
Yeah.
So perhaps lobbing you an easy question on Dinei Torah. So Jewish courts of arbitration are conducted, obviously, according to halakhic law. And they do have I think it's fair to say, a pretty bad reputation in Australia, owing to some instances of poor conduct. So two questions flowing from that. If you were advising a client in your former life, where you advised clients, would you recommend a Jewish committed Jew to have recourse to that system in Australia? And secondly, what do you think is the best that can be hoped for in terms of integrating Dinei Torah into our legal system? Is there a perfect world where it's seamless, or are there elements, for instance, perhaps some of the rules against going to secular courts, which might constitute contempt if they're enforced, which are just fundamentally incompatible?
Well, I don't know. There are controversial aspects to those questions, and
Many to pass, but
no. I'm happy to engage in it. Because you don't have to Google around for too long to see the report that I wrote with others in relation to this very issue, and possibly you've read it and you're alluding to that. The history of Beth Din arbitrations or Dinei Torah in Australia have had a sad history. And I've written and spoken about that on a number of occasions, and I think many people will be familiar with my views, and it's a lengthy and complex issue. But I think I think, first of all, there's no question that halachically adjudicating Jewish disputes before a Din Torah is not a negotiable halacha in halachic terms. So the focus has to be to professionalise and improve the opportunities for Beth Din arbitrations and to avoid the pitfalls of the past. And looking forward rather than backwards, I think there is every opportunity and every capacity to do that. I think there's a great willingness to do that, to professionalise and make that a real opportunity. Because I think a system of trustworthy and professionalised Beth Din arbitration would be a great service to the Australian Jewish community. I think the episode of, I've made no secret in the past, I think it is injudicious for Beth Dins to issue sanctions against people for not appearing before the Beth Din, not because I think the Beth Dins don't have halachically the power to do it, but just because I think it's counterproductive and injudicious. And I think the history of those events have shown that it's injudicious and counterproductive. But I think there's a wide recognition of that now, and I don't think there's very little prospect of that ever happening again. I think the lesson's been learned and accepted, and we move on.
Yep, let's hope. Moving to a totally different topic. In a recent High Court case concerning constitutional status of Aboriginal people, Justice Edelman said this in his first paragraph. Throughout history, the lives of dispossessed and exiled persons and their descendants have been sustained and their identities shaped by the hope of returning to their places of belonging. And I remember reading that and thinking that it might have been read in Hamizrahi publication or the like, maybe even more so than in the Commonwealth Law Reports. And then reading your welcome speech in the Supreme Court, it again struck me that after you acknowledged the traditional owners, you paused and, if I can paraphrase, you basically said that it's important not to let this practice of acknowledging to become a formulaic or rote practice, but to actually internalize in a genuine way the meaning of those words. And I know that I don't know anything about Justice Edelman other than the fact that he's Jewish, and you are Jewish. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the loudest supporters of Aboriginal rights in Australia are Jewish. And I wonder if there's something to it. Is there something about our historical memories that have motivated your feelings on this matter?
Unquestionably, yes. Do I know what was in Justice Edelman's mind? No, I don't. Do I suspect that his mind and soul is informed by that understanding? Probably I do. And in fact, I think that case came out of Western Australia, and I was still at the bar at the time, so I could be a little more candid than I can be after my appointment. But I recall telling the person who was involved, can I just say that in broad terms, in that application to the High Court, that my suspicion, and only a suspicion, is that if you draw Justice Edelman, you will lose. So that was that, and I obviously never discussed it with Justice Edelman, but I just think there is an innate understanding amongst Jews of the tragedy of dispossession. I did, in the 1990s, I did quite a lot of native title work, and I spent about 2 years where I went to the Pilbara, which is in the northwest of Western Australia, to represent two Aboriginal tribes, the Ngalama and the Injabandi tribes. They were negotiating with some of the huge multinational corporations that wanted to take more of their land, for more traditional land, for resource projects. And I had 2 years of consulting with and negotiating on behalf of the Ngalama and Injabandi tribes. And I've told this story quite a number of times. I mean, there are a whole range of stories that emerged out of that experience I had, but I came away from that experience a changed person, really, to deal with Aboriginal people living in really very, very challenging conditions. In the Pilbara, I don't know if you know, it's where it's a place called the Burrup Peninsula. For your listeners, who I imagine are all based in Melbourne, there's a fair bit of land west of Melbourne in Australia.
Filled with iron ore, yeah.
Between Melbourne and the Indian Ocean, there's quite a bit of land that people in Melbourne have probably never thought about, or certainly not been to. And it's part of Australia, which comes as a surprise to many people in Melbourne and Sydney. In the northwest, in the Pilbara, there's an incredibly resource-rich area called the Burrup Peninsula, and that's where all the liquid petroleum gas and iron ore, I mean, it's worth billions and billions to the Australian economy, and funds much of Collins Street. But I'm sounding like a parochial West Australian, that's to be deliberately provocative. But
you have
there's a sort of gleaming white city there called Karratha, which is a city built on the resource-rich industries. 60 kilometres from Karratha, there's a squalid town called Roban. And that's where I was based to do my work. It's a town with huge rates of infant mortality, substance abuse, suicide, squalor, and just appalling living conditions. 60 kilometres down, and in the Pilbara, 60 kilometres is down the road, okay, so you need to appreciate, from the gleaming white city of Karratha. And that really, that contrast is a very stark manifestation of the work that Australian society still has to do. And there's a lot of goodwill, there's much more recognition, particularly amongst people of your generation, of the need to do it. But it's very, very hard, and it will take a very, very long time. But there are many stories of my time there, but the one that I can share in relation to your particular question is that there'd been a series of white lawyers who'd gone up there to work with the Indigenous communities. And they refer to them, the community people refer to them as white fellow lawyers. And they imagined that I was, the latest in a series of white fellow lawyers. And the day I got there, I went to the Land Council, which was a fairly old ramshackle building in Roban. It was a smallish room. It had no air conditioning, and it was 47 degrees. And the room was packed to meet the new white fellow lawyer and discuss the path ahead. Within about 10 minutes of this chaotic discussion and me trying to introduce myself and get some instructions, a fight broke out among the people. A physical fight broke out among some of the members of the crowd, and I lost complete control of the meeting. And I tried to think how I could assert some authority and get their attention. And I had a moment of divine inspiration where I somehow made this huge noise just to get everybody's attention. And then I said to them, look, I know I'm a white fellow lawyer, but actually I have a tribe. And my tribe lost its land. And every time they fought amongst themselves, they lost their land. If you want to get your land back, you need to work together. And that had this, sometimes every so often in life, you think you've actually had an impact on people. That little speech had this huge impact on the people, on the community. And from that moment on, I think I had their confidence and their affection. And they would often say to me, you're not just another white fellow lawyer, you're a tribal man in your tribe. I think the beard helped. It was a different colour in those days, but nevertheless helped. And they saw me as a tribal man whose tribe had lost their land, lost its land. And that, I think, created a bond between me and the community that was very helpful in me being able to empathise with their plight and communicate with them. So that's a long answer to your question, the short answer to which is yes, Jews have a natural empathy and connection with the experience of Aboriginal people and Indigenous communities, all the more so because, if I could, we'll perhaps discuss that another time, but there's a huge difference, of course, and that is that when Jews were excluded from the system and dispossessed, they were brutalised and persecuted. When Jews were allowed back into the system, the irony is that 5 minutes after Jews have been allowed back into the system, they own it or control it or both. What is it about the Jewish experience and the Aboriginal experience that when Indigenous communities, when there's all the will in the world to give them opportunity, we can't bridge the gap? Whereas the experience of Jewish history is that Jews thrive whenever they're given the opportunity. And there are some very important issues in understanding the difference between the Jewish and the Aboriginal experience and the experience of Indigenous communities to understand why that is so. Not the least of which is that white settlement in this country not only took the land away from Aboriginal people, it destroyed their culture. And as they put it to me in a very moving discussion I had with them once, they didn't just take our land, they took our soul. And when people have their soul stolen from them in their culture, doesn't matter what opportunity you give them, they're unable to flourish. And that's the challenge for Australian society.
And maybe to the extent that Jewish historical successes in seizing back autonomy, to the extent that that's a cultural skill that might be transferable, maybe we need to give some thought to if we can assist.
Well, we also thrive in the system because in many respects we wrote the system. Western civilization emerged from the Judeo-Christian civilization. And so it's no surprise that when let back into the game, we play the game well. But that's because the game we're playing is the game we wrote. That's not the experience of Indigenous people. They're being given every opportunity in a system they don't relate to, and they don't have the cultural equipment to thrive in. And then you're saying, well, why? Hold on, we've given you equal opportunity. Now get it. What's wrong with you? I mean, that's what's so unfair about the comparison or the equivalence.
Yeah. We're running right up against our deadline. I hope we have time for just one final segment, which I'm borrowing from a favorite podcast of mine, and it's called Overrated or Underrated. And I'm going to throw out some ideas.
Which one am I, Jakob?
No, you have to respond.
Oh, I see.
You're of course underrated, but you have to respond as to whether you think this thing is over or underrated, or maybe appropriately rated. And important to note, it's not asking for your view on the objective value of the thing, just relative to the perception of others, whether it's over.
Is this a Jewish podcast? The one?
No, it isn't.
Right.
I can cite it. It is called Conversations with Tyler, and I do recommend it. So let's go.
You never get a one answer. You never get a one answer response from a Jew. You know that. So
no, you're entitled to expand. Yeah, well, the timing constraints are up to you how much you want to expand. Right, okay. I have no deadlines. So the first is charisma.
The notion of, what are you asking me?
The value.
The value of charisma.
Yeah, in all, I mean,
in society, is it overrated or underrated? Is that the question?
Yeah, let's go with that.
We're definitely overrated.
Okay.
Rational, in the sense that there's too much emphasis on charisma in our society. Yeah.
Yeah. Rational arguments in support of the existence of God.
Both overrated and underrated depending on context.
Do you want to elaborate or?
Well, how long have you got? I mean, I think rational arguments for the existence of God have their place and are very important. Ultimately, though, if a person is not persuaded by the rational arguments, they're not going to come to religious belief by a rational argument. They'll come to it from an inner consciousness or feeling or experience. But they have an important place, and so they can be overrated if people think that's the be-all and end-all of religious belief. They can be underrated if people think they're not worth anything.
Yeah. The intellectual benefits of learning Gemara. I would take it as a given that there's inherent religious value, but beyond that, as a training of the mind.
Say it again.
The intellectual benefits of learning Gemara.
Again, overrated for those who think that is the be-all and end of Judaism, underrated for those who think it's not necessary. So depends on context.
Yeah. Aliyah. This is the next one.
Yeah, okay. The importance of Aliyah?
No, Aliyah as a thing to do.
Well, you know, I'm now getting boring. Underrated for some, so it's underrated for those who don't think that it has both a Jewish historical and spiritual value of the greatest importance. Overrated for those who think that that was the be-all and end-all of Judaism.
And would you agree that that there are negative externalities of Aliyah within diaspora communities, which are underappreciated?
Say that sentence again. Perhaps
I'll say it another way.
Yeah.
Aliyah selects, I think, it selects for the most committed, the most idealistic people in a community. And an ideology which encourages those very people to pick up and leave regularly has detrimental effects on those left behind. And that might be an underappreciated aspect of...
Well, so that's the tension, right? So you take the most committed people and you encourage them to leave because that's the spiritual and historical ideal. On the other hand, it is a spiritual and historical ideal. So there's an unavoidable tension. But I do think that leaders of Jewish communities in the diaspora have an extremely important role to play. And I don't mean necessarily official leaders, but people who are playing leadership roles in one way or another have a great responsibility to see through the work that they do. I'll give you a practical example, because of course every one of these things depends on particular circumstance. But I'll give you a practical and one if you want to create controversy. I do not think that, let's take the Mizrahi community and kids go away for a year or 2 years or 3 years to yeshiva or midrashah. I think those people ought to come back and give to the community before they make Aliyah. I'm not a fan of people going on their shnut year or their 2 years and being inspired to stay on Aliyah and never coming back. The only reason they have that commitment is because of the community in which they developed, and they should come back and ensure that other people who are rising through the ranks have that experience. And then by all means, on the contrary, kol hakavod, then make Aliyah. But I do think that we have to, I am firmly of the view that people in that position should come back and contribute to the community in which they grew up and in which they were nurtured.
We'll do 2 more quick ones. State border closures.
Well, I think each government is doing its best to balance health and economic concerns for its particular constituency. And as a judge of the Supreme Court, I think you would not expect me to say anything else, Jakob.
So appropriately rated, we'll say. And lastly, courtroom formalities and etiquette.
I think they are about right where they are. I think that a courtroom is a forum of gravitas. It's a serious place. I'm not in favour of informality in a courtroom, but nor am I in favour of growling judges being unpleasant. There needs to be a balance. In my experience, the balance is about right. Obviously, every judge runs his or her court in accordance with their own preference. But by and large, I think modern judges run a courtroom which appropriately balances formality with pleasantness. Both important.
All right, well, we'll stop there. We've gone a bit over. So I'm handing off to Matan to wrap us up, but I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent questions, Jakob.
I'm glad. I hope it was interesting for everyone else. And
well, you and I seem to have had a good time, Jakob.
Well, that's all that matters. And on a serious note, going back to our very first question, I think that your elevation really makes us all walk a bit taller, and we thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying so.
Matan.
Thank you very much to both Yaakov and Rabbi Solomon.